Een beetje moeilijk alleen tonen.
Nu dat ik meer dan een jaar samenwoon met Wasil, blijkt ook dat die culturele verschillen dat dan niet het moeilijke is aan samenwonen. Het zou fijn zijn eigenlijk als meer mensen dat beseffen, waarom dat geen probleem hoeft te zijn dat andere mensen naar hier komen. Integendeel, ik denk dat een heel grote verrijking kan zijn. En hij heeft ons samenwonen ook wel bewezen, denk ik. Ik heb er heel veel aan overgehouden. Ik woon heel graag samen. Ik denk ook dat we wel een beetje vrienden zijn geworden.
Ja, hij is een beetje mijn vriend geworden en zoals grote broer.
自分のアイデンティティとか、セクシャリティとかジェンダーとかそういうところでずっとこう自分探しをしていて、絵を描いたりとかファッションを学んだりとかしていく中でダンスに出会いました。その時に初めてこう自己一致みたいな風にできたんです。荒木純です。ドラッグクイーンのマダム・ボンジュール・ジャンジです。パフォーマンスアーティストです。ジューシーなど楽しい LGBTQ みんなが集まれるバー作りとか、最近はドラッグクイーンによる絵本の読み聞かせ BKSH 東京の活動とかをしています。自分が舞台に出て表現していく時に派手なメイクとかゴージャスな衣装とかいろいろ工夫していく中で、周りからドラッグクイーンというふうに言われて、ドラッグクイーンってなんだろうと思って調べて、ゲイのカルチャーの中から出てきた言葉で、女性性を過剰にこう表現する、カリカチュアするみたいな、そういうことを知り、自分を振り返った時に、自分は女性器があるけれどもドラッグクイーンだなっていうのがすごくこう腑に落ちました。小学校の時はみんなあんまり性別を意識せずに一緒にサッカーしたりとか缶蹴りしたりとか遊んでて楽しかったんですけど、やっぱりこう高学年になっていったり中学入ったりすると男子女子みたいに何でも分けられるようになって、それがだんだん窮屈になって、声とかも嫌だったしね、体が女性化していくこととかも受け入れがたかったです。友達もいたけど、でもなんかこう常に居場所がないというか、なんかそこにいていないような、なんか透明人間になったような感じみたいなのはずっと持っていたかなって思いますね。時期によって手術をしたいぐらいまで考えていた時もあるけれども、今自分は男でも女でもないっていうジャンジっていうふうに思っています。こんにちは。どうも。ようこそ。HIV の問題ってすごくこう治療的には進歩してきているんですけども、やっぱり人権的な問題が解決されていなくて、スティグマというのかな、 HIV 陽性であることを周りにカミングアウトしづらい状況があったりとか、職場とか、いろいろなところで、差別的なことが起こったりっていうこともまだまだあります。偏見をどう解決していくか、あと HIV が特別な人の病気ではない、誰でもかかりうるというところで、どうやって自分のこととして考えてもらえるかっていう工夫をすごくしています。ドラッグクイーンストーリーアワー東京では3歳から8歳を対象にしてるんですけど、社会の枠に収まっていないような時に、多様な人と出会って、ドラッグクイーンという異質なものに出会って、それが楽しい経験として残れば、もしその子が LGBTQ だった時には OK っていう後押しになるし、周りにそういう子がいてもなんかいじめとかそういうふうにはならないようにできるのかなとか。あとは自分が何かって時にこう振り返って、あんな大人もいたな、そっかそっかとか、なんかちょっと思い出せる、エンパワーメントできるような機会になればなっていうふうには思います。いろんなお友達がいて OK。 割と自分は気に入っていて読んでるのがトトパールさんの「It's OK to be different」っていう絵本なんですけど、そこにも色が違っていても OK とか他の人と違っていて OK だよっていうメッセージがたくさん出てきます。楽しく分かりやすく伝える、声を上げることと同時に特に子どもたちかなを中心にいろいろな人たちとそういう体験を重ねていけたらなっていうふうに思ってます。
どんな自分でも OK。じゃあね、ありがとう。マダムボンジュールジャッジがお届けしました。
Isihni hadikta yang dihairu Numai nadaya tulak sugeni ho nadaya kateki dan hugadak sugeni Pagi garadak sugeni Dayu hili asitak sugeni Awai amrit ni hakki wa iti gaira jeni hakki wa iti fakinna saat mi innal gina hindi.
Good morning, colleagues. The 9,383rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Syria, and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, the Director of Coordination at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pedersen.
Thank you, Madam President. For several months, we have been urging and advising that the new diplomatic context surrounding the Syrian conflict could act as a circuit breaker if there was substantive engagement. With substantive engagement, diplomacy could begin to see important issues addressed incrementally in a manner that would move us along the path envisaged in Security Council Resolution 2254. I have sought to engage the Syrian parties, the Arab, the Astana and Western players, and the Council to build positively on this, to promote coordination, coherence and complementarity on Syria, and to urge everyone to be ready to offer a genuine contribution. The goals are clear: to resume the intra-Syrian political process, facilitated by the United Nations, most particularly by reconvening the Constitutional Committee and making incremental progress when we do, and also to elicit from all key parties confidence-building measures, step for step and step by step, in a reciprocal and verifiable manner, consistent with my mandate in Security Council Resolution 2254. And I have consistently stressed that addressing the dire and worsening humanitarian situation is not only a humanitarian necessity, but will give some confidence that progress on political issues is also possible. President, after the earthquakes, as you remember, we did see positive humanitarian gestures. I can therefore only share the Secretary General's disappointment that the Security Council could not agree to extend its authorization of UN cross-border relief operations, a lifeline for millions of Syrians. How are the Syrians meant to believe that some broader progress is possible? And how are they meant to be encouraged to overcome their own deep differences if consensus on humanitarian basics among international parties is elusive? As the political envoy, I profoundly hope that all doors are kept open to resolve this issue, and that the Council and all stakeholders put the needs of the Syrians first. We must redouble efforts to find a solution that ensures that the continued delivery of cross-border and cross-line humanitarian assistance continue. Nothing is more important right now for the most vulnerable Syrians than this. Let me also note that we need a redoubled effort to secure sufficient humanitarian resources and rapid disbursement at a time when funding is more stretched than ever. This year's humanitarian response plan is some 13% funded, while the Regional Refugee and Resilience Fund is less than 10% funded. I urge donors to step up and stand with the millions of people in Syria and in the region in host countries who depend on life-saving humanitarian aid, as well as early recovery and livelihood support after a decade of war. I also call on sanctioning countries to continue to mitigate any effects of sanctions that could worsen the living conditions of Syrian civilians. I'm glad that the European Union and United Kingdom have extended their new humanitarian exemptions on Syria, which they issued in the aftermath of the earthquake. Such types of extensions, together with enhanced attention to countering overcompliance, are much needed. President, on the political front, let's be honest. So far, months of potentially significant diplomacy have not translated into concrete outcomes for Syrians on the ground, at home or abroad, or real moves in the political process. I hope they will soon, because if not, it will be another missed opportunity to help the Syrian conflict to come to a negotiated end at a time when the impact of the crisis is deepening. A Syrian track and a wider process of steps-for-steps confidence building, both are needed now if we are to move forward. President, I welcome the fact that reconvening the Constitutional Committee is a clear point of consensus among many key players. But I'm disappointed that disputes over the venue, which have arisen entirely due to issues unrelated to Syria, so far have prevented this from coming to pass. We need political will to overcome the issues that so far prevent it from reconvening in Geneva and to ensure that it resumes and makes credible progress. Let me pause here to remind you why this is important. While not all issues are solely in the hands of the Syrians, one issue that can and must be only in their hands is the future constitution of their country. The social contract that must underpin the ultimate reconciliation of Syrians and that would set for a post-conflict future the powers and duties of the state and the rights and obligations of its citizens. This is why the constitutional basket is core to Resolution 2254, which inter alia sets a constitutional process to develop a new constitution. The Constitutional Committee brings together nominees of the government, the Syrian Negotiations Commission, and the middle third, civil society, on the basis they have formally agreed in the terms of reference to prepare and draft for popular approval a constitutional reform as a contribution to the political settlement in Syria and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. In the 8 sessions to date, progress has been very slow, no doubt about it. And there are reasons for that I have referred to in the past. But I am convinced, as I believe are most stakeholders, that it is better for all the Syrian people that this process resume, continue, deepen, and gradually build some trust and move forward on substance. This last point, substance, is essential. I and my team are fully engaged in the effort to unblock the impasse and find a way forward. President, a second area I have long sought to unlock is how to move forward incrementally towards a safe, calm environment in Syria, something that would obviously overlap heavily with the question of the refugees and the internally displaced, which has gained heightened attention in the region. At present, conditions are simply not in place for safe, dignified, and voluntary refugee returns. And refugees must be protected, including from refoulement, just as all civilians inside Syria, including IDPs, must be protected. That is why we need the Syrian government doing more to address the very real and continuing protection concerns, something that is absolutely fundamental and on which I have continually underlined. We will at the same time continue to engage donors on doing more to address the concerns all Syrians have about livelihoods. Such a step-for-step dynamic could begin to change realities on the ground for all Syrians, not only the displaced, but including for them, and also build confidence and political space for a broader set of issues related to Resolution 2254, bringing us towards a safe, calm, and neutral environment. In this context, I have continued to coordinate closely with the High Commissioner for Refugees and the Emergency Relief Coordinator. President, let me stress that this is one among several topics where a wider steps-for-steps discussions could be productive. There are many others, as I have flagged in the past. We need engagement on them because, as Syrian civil society constantly reminds us, while diplomacy has continued, many things remain entirely unchanged in this war. Syria remains territorially divided, with Syrian society too divided on many issues. 5 foreign armies are present in Syria, and we have seen concerning tensions among these armies on the rise this past month. Civilians continue to be arbitrarily detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared. They continue to be injured and killed amid violent clashes. Regular exchanges of mortar, rocket, and artillery fire across northeast and northwest Syria. This month also saw airstrikes attributed to Israel, reports of Turkish drone strikes, reports of pro-government airstrikes north of Aleppo, and the US saying it carried out drone strikes on an ISIL leader near Al-Bab. Tensions in the southwest spilled over into military escalation once again. Sustained calm leading to a nationwide ceasefire remains essential, and the threat posed by listed terrorist groups remains very real, and it must be addressed in a cooperative manner. President, meanwhile, Syria's economic crisis is deepening. Just one example. This month, the Syrian pound hit record lows, with the official rate for the first time crossing the 12,000 Syrian pound mark relative to $1 US. The impact of this on all Syrians, 9 out of 10 of whom are living below the poverty line, is extremely serious. Just take one indicator. This means some workers now earn less than $8 US a month, when in June this year, they were earning some $18 US a month. This means that the family can hardly afford one meal a day. Basic services and other critical infrastructure are now on the verge of collapse. In the scorching summer heat, some households can only access less than 3 hours of electricity and primary water supplies a day on average. Some have less access or even no access at all. When they are unable to secure basic needs, some families adopt negative coping mechanisms. They reduce meals, they resort to child labor, and of course, as a last resort, many simply find ways to leave Syria. President, the tragedy of the detained, the disappeared, and the missing remains unchanged too. At least here, the General Assembly's decision to establish the independent institution on missing persons is a sign of hope. I urge the parties to the conflict to cooperate with it, as well as to share information with families on the fate of the missing, just as it would if action were taken to release detainees at scale and to cease practices which are still very much reported of arrests of returnees or of children forcibly taken to military training camps, or the continued practice of torture in detention leading to deaths. President, if we are to move forward, I would appeal to the Syrian government to work proactively with the United Nations in pursuit of a political path out of this conflict. I will also continue to work with the Syrian Negotiations Commission, whom my deputy Najad Rochi met this month in Geneva. I thank the many in the region and beyond who have sought to reinforce the UN's core message in this regard, and I continue to prioritize working closely with the actors in the region. And as we all do this, we will continue to consult widely with the Syrian civil society and Syrian women, including through the Civil Society Support Room and Women's Advisory Board. President, to shift the dynamics requires engagement in the spirit of pragmatism and flexibility, and a greater sense of urgency and pace. It requires a constructive and coordinated international diplomacy in support of genuine confidence building. And it requires regional and international unity in support of the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated political process to restore Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity, and to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. The more you can work together despite your differences, the more you can encourage and support the Syrians to do the same. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin with an urgent and common concern. That is the continuation of cross-border assistance to northwest Syria to provide vital support to millions of vulnerable civilians. As has been said so many times in this chamber, cross-border aid is a matter of life and death for these millions of people. The future of the cross-border assistance should not be a political decision, but a humanitarian one. And therefore, it was deeply disappointing, as the Secretary General has said, when the Security Council was not able to reach an agreement on extending its authorization of UN cross-border relief operations in Syria. Madam President, the United Nations and its partners stand ready to continue providing cross-border, life-saving humanitarian assistance through Bab al-Hawa at the scope and scale needed. And we have taken note of the letter from the government of Syria granting the United Nations permission to use the Bab al-Hawa crossing to deliver humanitarian aid in northwest Syria. We continue to engage on the terms outlined in that letter and the modalities that are fundamental to our principled operations. Several council members have indeed encouraged the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the government of Syria to undertake bilateral discussions about the modalities for humanitarian operations in northwest Syria. And we will pursue this engagement to ensure that we have the working modalities to allow us to fulfill our mandate in a principled manner. Madam President, in the meantime, UN personnel, relief supplies and protection assistance continue to enter northwest Syria via the Bab al-Salam and al-Rai border crossings. Since 10 July, 18 trucks and 10 cross-border missions have used these two crossings to replenish stocks, monitor programs, and assess needs on the ground. Our essential operations are, for now, taking place through these two crossings. In parallel, most of the UN agencies are currently using the humanitarian aid items that have been strategically pre-positioned inside northwest Syria prior to 10 July to ensure continuity of the humanitarian assistance. And as we have indicated already, cross-border operations in northwest Syria have always been and must continue to be guided by the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. The overriding objective is to ensure safe and timely access to civilians in need at the speed and scale required. The UN cross-border operation is among the most scrutinized humanitarian operations in the world, and the future of any monitoring mechanism at the border crossings will need to be explored to guarantee the humanitarian nature of cross-border consignments. Moreover, once assistance enters Syria, the strong monitoring of aid delivery remains. It is done at 3 distinct levels and is a critical component of UN cross-border operations. I'm hopeful that the consent granted by the government of Syria to use the 2 additional crossings of Bab al-Salam and al-Rai border crossings will be extended before it expires on 13 August. These crossings will remain indispensable for the foreseeable future. Record levels of needs give even greater urgency to facilitating humanitarian access through all available routes, both cross-border and cross-line, in line with the obligation to facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of relief under international humanitarian law. Madam President, some of Syria's most vulnerable populations live in the northwest of the country. 4.1 out of 4.6 million people who live there need humanitarian assistance to meet their most basic needs. Nearly 80% of these people are women and children. In order to address these severe levels of vulnerability, we need greater predictability that a 3 or 6 month permission does not provide. Such a short duration poses serious challenges to our operations, funding, logistics, and procurement, and in all likelihood, it could lead to disruptions in the humanitarian response. Furthermore, such short timeframes do not provide us with the minimum time needed for effective early recovery programming, including support for livelihoods and the rehabilitation of infrastructure damaged by the earthquakes. We will continue our concerted effort to scale up early recovery activities throughout Syria. Madam President, I am also deeply alarmed by the intense hostilities in northwest Syria in the past weeks, with airstrikes and shelling resulting in civilian casualties. These hostilities have also left people in fear of more attacks and could fuel further displacement. Altogether, since the beginning of this year, at least 26 civilians have been killed, including 5 women and 6 children, and at least 74 civilians injured, according to monitoring carried out by the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. As the fighting and hostilities continue, I urge the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and to take all feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm. Madam President, throughout Syria, socio-economic conditions continue to deteriorate, as the Special Envoy has just mentioned. The rapid deterioration of the currency to a new record low in July and other forms of economic deterioration have resulted in significant food and fuel price hikes. The price of essential food commodities has surged by over 90% in the course of this year, putting basic food items and other essentials out of the reach of millions of families. Some 12 million people, more than 50% of the population, are currently food insecure, and a further 2.9 million are at risk of sliding into hunger. Madam President, despite these severe vulnerabilities, the 2023 humanitarian response plan for Syria is only 13.3% funded. I'm extremely concerned about the consequences of such acute underfunding, which means that we will have to further prioritize our response and make difficult choices again this year. This will likely compromise life-saving assistance and curtail investments in livelihoods and essential services. They will result in more dropouts from school, more acute food insecurity, and fewer protection interventions. To give you an example of what this means in practice, beneficiaries of food assistance are currently receiving only 50% of the standard ration size. In addition, assistance to up to 40% of them, or 2.5 million people, have been discontinued this month due to funding shortfalls. 1 month after the Brussels conference, it is now critical that generous pledges announced be converted into early dispersals of funding. Madam President, we are now at a moment of inflection, one of change, but also continuity. As the Secretary General regularly reiterates in all our discussions, deliberations, and decisions, we must keep our collective focus on addressing the urgent needs of the people of Syria. This includes ensuring the delivery of comprehensive and predictable life-saving humanitarian assistance through the most effective means, advocating for the funding required to do so, and demanding that the parties respect international law and renew meaningful efforts to secure a nationwide ceasefire, a political settlement, and an end to the conflict. We cannot give up on the people of Syria. The people of Syria are indeed counting on us. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingham for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, dear colleagues, I speak on behalf of Brazil and Switzerland, co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. I will after speak in my national capacity. We welcome Syria's, Turkey's, and Iran's participation in today's meeting. We thank Special Envoy Guy Pedersen and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham for their briefings. On July 13th, the permanent mission of Syria informed of its government's decision to open the Bab al-Hawa border crossing for the UN's use for 6 months. We appreciate the increasing cooperation between the Syrian government and OCHA for the provision of life-saving humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. While the decision by the Syrian government can be a basis for the UN to lawfully conduct cross-border humanitarian operations through Bab al-Hawa, we have listened very carefully to OCHA's concerns about the 13th July not verbal. We have also heard various other stakeholders, both governmental and non-governmental, in this regard. We welcome the willingness of both OCHA and the Syrian government to discuss the terms under which humanitarian operations through Bab al-Hawa could continue. We reiterate that whatever solution is found to continue alleviating the plight of Syrians must fully comply with international humanitarian law and be fully consistent with the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. This means that aid must reach all those in need without any discrimination. According to international humanitarian law, parties are under the obligation to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to civilians in need. Financing instruments and monitoring are key issues to take into consideration in any continued cross-border operation by the United Nations. We recall that all access modalities, including cross-line aid deliveries, remain a crucial part of the whole of Syria approach. Madam President, as we know, Bab al-Hawa has been the primary hub for United Nations humanitarian operations into northwest Syria, handling 85% of deliveries. It is therefore with concern that we note that no United Nations aid has entered through that location since the cross-border mechanism expired almost 2 weeks ago. This only adds to the anxiety of the millions of people in need in northwest Syria who do not know if they will receive life-saving aid. We must not forget the human price attached to this kind of uncertainty. We remain hopeful that an understanding can be reached to resume its use by the United Nations, and as co-pen holders, stand ready for any necessary support. Madam President, we remain concerned about the very low funding for the humanitarian response plan. The United Nations and its partners require increased support to address growing needs in Syria, particularly after the February earthquakes. We echo the calls for more humanitarian funding, including for early recovery and livelihood programs in all areas of Syria. At the same time, we recognize that donor countries need predictability of humanitarian activities and trust in the implementability and continuation of agreements for continued funding. Monitoring and reporting on the delivery of humanitarian aid plays a crucial part in building this assurance. As co-pen holders, Switzerland and Brazil have been guided solely by the humanitarian imperative. We remain committed to working with Council members, OCHA, Syria, and other interested stakeholders, as well as the humanitarian actors. We have been doing so from the start. We have kept doing it since Tuesday the 11th, and we will keep doing it to ensure that the ultimate goal of assisting the Syrian population is fully met and our role as co-pen holders is fulfilled at its best. Madam President, I now make this statement in my national capacity. Brazil fully concurs with the Secretary General in his assessment that nothing would do more to alleviate the suffering in Syria and stem the tide of humanitarian needs than an inclusive, comprehensive, and sustainable political solution to end the conflict in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254/2015. The significance of Resolution 2254 cannot be overstated, as it provides a clear roadmap for a peaceful resolution of the conflict while respecting Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, territorial integrity, and dignity. It is crucial for all parties involved to adhere to and act in accordance with these principles. It is also imperative that all parties exercise maximum restraint, avoid further escalation, and fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We condemn any unilateral actions that promote further violence and instability in the region. We firmly oppose terrorism and all forms of violence that jeopardize the safety and well-being of civilians. A comprehensive ceasefire is long overdue. Some may consider a negotiated solution unrealistic. In Brazil's view, what is illusory is the idea that a military solution would bring true peace to all Syrians or be a solid basis for the reconstruction and development of Syria. Recent positive developments, such as the country's return to the League of Arab States, have opened potentially important avenues to meaningful progress that seemed impossible just a while ago. We agree with the Special Envoy. It is essential not to miss the opportunity for re-engagement brought about by the current positive momentum. It is also crucial to resume a credible intra-Syrian political process with tangible results in the short term, including the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen for his continuous efforts in this regard and his continuous engagement with relevant actors. We reiterate our call on all parties to genuinely commit to finding the path to democratic freedom, stability, and development in Syria. Let us be clear, they all owe it to their fellow citizens inside and outside the country. Thank you, Madam President.
The representative of Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Mr. Rajasingham, for your briefings today. Over the past month, this Council has met several times on this issue, and we've done so because the humanitarian needs in Syria are so great, because the stakes are so high. As we all know, the pen holders, Brazil and Switzerland, made every effort to reach a compromise resolution on cross-border assistance, but one permanent member stood in the way of Council action. Let's be clear here. Russia is fully responsible for the lapse in UN cross-border deliveries of humanitarian assistance through Bab al-Hawa. Russia refused to negotiate in good faith. And its veto was yet another reminder that Russia has little or no regard for the needs of vulnerable people. Just today, reports indicate that Russia carried out another round of attacks on Ukraine's grain infrastructure. Russia continues to wage war on the world's food supply, which is having devastating consequences, especially for people in Syria and in countries across the Middle East and Africa. Colleagues, the Assad regime's announcement to allow UN aid deliveries through Bab al-Hawa acknowledges the need for cross-border assistance, but it includes unacceptable restrictions, restrictions that would hinder relief and put humanitarians, including UN personnel, at risk. And I note that their opening of Bab al-Salam and al-Raid did not include such restrictions. Additionally, the regime's permission is only for 6 months, half the minimally necessary period recommended by the Secretary General. As Undersecretary General Griffiths continues to engage the Assad regime on the parameters of future UN operations, we must remember that the regime has a record of impeding UN humanitarian activities in Syria. We've seen that time and time again for more than a decade. The unacceptable conditions and demands contained in the July 13th note verbal are consistent with that troubling record. And for this reason, the United States has joined other major donors in making clear that any cross-border access arrangement must include 5 key elements. First, it must preserve the independence of operations. The UN should be allowed to engage with all parties on the ground, consistent with how it delivers assistance around the world. Second, it must maintain the whole of Syria response architecture. The UN should be able to continue to operate response hubs outside regime-held areas. And the regime should not interfere with access arrangements between the UN and local authorities in non-regime-held areas. Third, access should be granted for as long as possible and must not lapse in the middle of winter. Guaranteed access is essential to providing the predictability and the efficiency needed by donors, UN partners, and the Syrian people. Given the overwhelming and persistent humanitarian needs in northwest Syria, there is no justification for short-term ad hoc access guarantees. Fourth, assistance delivery must remain consistent with humanitarian principles. The UN should maintain its ability to determine assistance allocation, including design and targeting, based solely on needs and consistent with the principles of neutrality and impartiality. Fifth, any arrangement must maintain the cross-border monitoring operation originally established under Resolution 2165 and avoid new reporting requirements for local partners or beneficiaries. All 5 of these elements are critical. They will bolster trust among donor nations and implementing partners, reaffirm the UN operations will be guided only by humanitarian principles, maintain and strengthen protections for partners and donors' funding, and give humanitarian workers the predictability they need to save lives. We appreciate Undersecretary General Griffith's commitment to keeping the Council and donor apprised of the progress of his talks with the regime, and we're prepared for the Council to review any understanding he reaches to ensure it contains these elements. Anything less than what I've outlined today would necessitate this Council to seek a mandate to reauthorize the cross-border mechanism. Colleagues, more than 62,000 trucks full of life-saving aid, food and water and medicine and other essentials have crossed into Syria since the Council unanimously supported Resolution 2165 in 2014. But today, the humanitarian crisis has never been more dire. 12 years of war and this year's earthquake have pushed the Syrian people to the brink. The Syrian people are crying out for support, and more than anything, for peace. The United States is deeply saddened, but not surprised by Special Envoy Pedersen's briefing, which made clear that the political situation in Syria remains bleak. Make no mistake, the blame rests on Russia and the Assad regime. Russia and the regime have put the Constitutional Committee on ice. They have rebuffed Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to launch a step-for-step process, and they have opposed or obstructed most efforts to advance other aspects of Resolution 2254, including by voting against the General Assembly's decision to create a new apolitical mechanism to address the fate of detainees and disappeared persons. The bottom line is this: given Syria's shameful record, the Council cannot trust the Assad regime to do the right thing on humanitarian access. The Council must remain deeply engaged on humanitarian matters in Syria. The United States is committed to doing just that. Special Envoy Pedersen asked us to stand up and meet the needs of the Syrian people, and that is exactly what we are trying to do. We will never waver in our support for the needs of the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Special Envoy, Mr. Gary Peterson, and the Director of Coordination of OCHA, Ramesh Rajasingham, for their reports on the political and humanitarian aspects of the situation in Syria. Today, the situation on the ground in the friendly country of Syria remains fraught with tension. Beyond the illegitimate and illegal military presence in the north of Syria, including the presence of the United States and their allies in the Trans-Caucasus. Beyond these, there are other dangerous factors emanating from the arbitrary airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force targeting Damascus and its vicinities, the latest of which took place on 19 July. We are troubled by the activity of terrorists in the south of the country. They are exploiting the cover of the so-called security zone, which was arbitrary at Atanf, which was arbitrarily established by Washington. We believe that the return of the Syrian Arab Republic to the Arab family and the restoration of relations with Turkey facilitates an overall improvement of the atmosphere in the Middle East region and helps to facilitate an expeditious resolution to the Syrian crisis. In this context, what is clumsy and inappropriate are attempts by Western countries to obstruct these natural processes. We view such unconstructive steps as intervention in sovereign decisions of states and politicization of these purely humanitarian issues, as early recovery and facilitating a return of refugees. The Russian Federation has consistently and unstintingly advocated the process of a political resolution in Syria that is Syrian-owned, Syrian-led, with support from the United Nations, strictly in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. At the same time, we believe that the modalities for international mediation need to be based on respect for the principles of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. The Syrian people themselves, without external pressure, should reach agreement on all outstanding issues related to future arrangements in their country. The only platform for such direct intra-Syrian dialogue was and remains the Constitutional Committee. Any attempts to impose other frameworks, formulae, or schemes on the Syrian people will bring the situation to a deadlock. Work of the committee will resume after selection by parties of a convenient platform for meetings instead of Switzerland. And we understand that this is a process that is nearing conclusion. Turning to humanitarian aspects, merely 5 days since the discussion of this issue at the General Assembly, we have nothing new to add to what was stated by us on last Wednesday. We are pleased that now international humanitarian assistance to Syria will be carried out in a way that is similar to other country contexts, that is, with the consent and in close coordination with the internationally recognized government of the country. We trust that the UN humanitarian team will adopt a serious approach to the establishment of the cross-border humanitarian assistance to Idlib under the new circumstances through Bab al-Hawa, which has already been the case with Bab al-Salam and al-Rai. In Aleppo context, the UN Mr. Griffith's team has all the necessary tools to achieve this. There is no need for any further decisions by the Security Council to that end, and let us bear in mind that assistance to those in need needs to be provided through all possible channels, including through contact lines. We hope that OCHA will not do the bidding of Western states who have literally lost sleep at the prospect of the United Nations having to, as is right and proper, cooperate with legitimate Syrian authorities. Humanitarian personnel now have an excellent opportunity to begin with a clean state and to finally prioritize the interests of those who need humanitarian assistance, including those residing in government-held territories, and not internationally recognized terrorists and their Western sponsors who have entrenched themselves in Idlib. And this needs to be done, as is right and proper, with respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. You have this straightforward and customary instrument, namely the United Nations Humanitarian Plan for Syria, in which, as we heard today, is again woefully underfunded. We urge those donors who place the interests of those in need above geopolitical considerations to react to the UN call and to help with financing early recovery projects in all of Syria. To conclude, I wish to take this opportunity to put a number of questions to the representative of OCHA. What is the fate of the report of the UN country team in Syria on the impact of unilateral sanctions on the humanitarian situation in that country? This is an issue which by no no means should be disregarded by the UN humanitarian wing, for we are talking about effectively collective punishment of millions of ordinary civilians. Otherwise, everything that we agreed upon here will be to no avail. Moreover, we would like to hear about what under new circumstances, what is the status of the Inter-Secretariat Manual of the UN Secretary General entitled Parameters and Principles for the Delivery of Humanitarian Assistance to Syria, which, as we know, this manual prohibits UN structures from conducting recovery work in Syria. Is it not time now to consign this disgraceful document to history? Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 members, Gabon, Ghana, and my own country, Mozambique. We would like to thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and the OCHA Director of Coordination, Mr. Ramesh Rajasinghe, for their important presentations. We welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Turkey. Madam President, the political and security crisis has persisted in Syria for more than a decade. It is compounded with a humanitarian crisis and the effects of last February's earthquake, which are still being felt. As a consequence, more than 23 million people are subjected to daily suffering. Humanitarian needs are only growing, and the grief of the Syrian people is at all-time high. In this context, the A3 welcome once again the Syrian government's decision to extend emergency measures, including the opening of 2 additional crossings at Bab al-Salem and Al-Rai until 13th August 2023. We take note of the government's decision to grant the United Nations and its specialized agencies authorization to use the Bab al-Awa crossing to deliver humanitarian aid to civilians in need in northwest Syria in full cooperation and coordination with the Syrian government for a period of 6 months, starting on July 13th, 2023. We are counting on the determination of the United Nations and this Council to do everything possible to stabilize and improve the humanitarian and living conditions of the Syrian people. We must continue our efforts to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid through all modalities to those in need throughout the Syrian territory. We note that the Secretary General's report underscores the importance of the cross-border operations. As many as 1,068 trucks crossed into northwestern Syria from Turkey via the Bab al-Awa crossing. During the reporting period, 127 trucks re-entered Syria through the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai border crossing points. The United Nations has carried out 116 inter-agency cross-border missions in the Northwest since February 14th. These humanitarian operations must continue without interruption, as access to the most basic needs and the survival of millions of people, 80% of whom are women and children, depend on them. Syria is facing a number of challenges that deserve to be highlighted. Lack of reliable access to drinking water in sufficient quantities throughout the north of the country, chronic fuel and electricity shortages against the backdrop of a cholera pandemic, the total collapse of basic social services, particularly for women and girls, and increasing protection problems such as gender-based violence, malnutrition, and psychological disorders among children. Given the scale of these challenges, the international community must act urgently to respond in an effective and coordinated manner. The country's humanitarian situation must not be instrumentalized. Gabon, Ghana, and Mozambique note with interest the achievement of the 398 million funding target for the emergency appeal for the earthquake in Syria. We also welcome the results of the 7th Brussels Conference on Syria in the region held on June 14 and 15, which recorded pledges of over $4.9 billion for 2023 and over $1 million for 2024. We renew our appeal to the donors to honor their pledges. Madam President, on the political front, the A3 remain convinced that only a concerted political solution will enable the Syrian people to regain peace, security, stability, and dignity. This implies the cessation of hostilities, the restoration of state authority over the entire Syrian territory, and an inclusive dialogue in good faith involving all walks of Syrian society, including women, youth, and minority groups. The current divisions within the Syrian political class and the crisis of confidence between the parties make the prospect of an intra-Syrian dialogue within the Constitutional Committee seem far removed. We urge all parties to set aside their differences and give fresh impetus to the political process. The A3 also encouraged the role and support of regional players and all other states with influence on either side in the quest for peace and stability. The strong commitment and good faith of the countries in the region are fundamental to achieve this objective. In this connection, we welcome Syria's return to the Arab League. We remain convinced that Security Council Resolution 2254 remains the main roadmap for achieving a political solution to the crisis in Syria while respecting the national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of the Syrian Arab Republic. We remain deeply concerned over the persistence of hostilities, particularly in northern Syria. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire in the interest of the Syrian people and the stability of the region. The parties to the conflict must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular by ensuring the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Cases of arbitrary detention by parties to the conflict are a violation of fundamental freedoms. We urge all stakeholders to strictly respect the right of all to freedom of expression. DA3 remain concerned about the presence of foreign military forces in the Syrian territory. This undermines regional and international security. We reiterate our position that Syria should not be used as a battleground for geopolitical rivalries. Madam President, DA3 reaffirmed their support for the Special Envoy, Mr. Guy Pedersen. We appreciate his efforts to bring an end to the conflict that has been tearing Syria apart for over 12 years. The Syrian people continue to pay a heavy price. All the parties involved and the international community as a whole must do their utmost to tackle the humanitarian situation, devoid of political considerations and guided solely by the interests of the Syrian people. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Director Rajasingham for their remarks. As we have just heard, the humanitarian demands of Syria remain the largest worldwide. We anticipate a dramatic increase in needs, exacerbating an already immense humanitarian crisis resulting from more than 12 years of conflict in Syria. The funding of the humanitarian response plan is at an all-time low. The cross-border authorization of Bab al-Hawa was the lifeline for over 4 million people in northwest Syria. The use of veto by Russia on the renewal of the UN Security Council Resolution 2672 was a terrible setback. The sovereign decision of Syrian regime, with conditions, does not provide sufficient predictability for UN and humanitarian partners to deliver humanitarian assistance in a timely and efficient manner. Syria remains an emergency, and the Assad regime, with the complicity of Russia, have managed to politicize every humanitarian aspect of the crisis. There are no doubts, Russia is weaponizing the humanitarian aid for political gains. In support of the humanitarian imperative, we underline again the need to ensure humanitarian access via all modalities, including cross-border and cross-lines humanitarian aid and early recovery. I reiterate Albania's firm position that humanitarian realities on the ground must drive us to find a solution through a Security Council resolution. Colleagues, we deplore the lack of progress by the regime to allow the political transition in Syria in line with Council Resolution 2254, which remains stalled despite the tireless efforts by the Special Envoy. By preventing the Constitutional Committee to reconvene and make substantial progress towards the constitutional framework for Syria, as Special Envoy Pedersen underlined, the Assad regime is reconfirming the lack of its goodwill and faith. We all know the root cause of all suffering in Syria is political, and it can be alleviated only through a lasting political solution. Syrians have lost hope in the political process, and there is huge uncertainty about what the future holds. We remain convinced that respect for human rights, justice, and ending impunity for serious crimes are indispensable for lasting peace in Syria. We welcome the adoption of the resolution of 29 June 2023 by the United Nations General Assembly for the establishment of a new mechanism dedicated to clarifying the fate and whereabouts of missing people in Syria and to address a humanitarian imperative. We must prove to the people of Syria that they are not left alone. Now they need help more than ever, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame President, I would like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Mr. Rajasingham for their briefings. The war in Syria is continuing, as well as the suffering of the Syrian people. 12 million people have been displaced. Millions of them have found shelter in neighboring countries or elsewhere. 130,000 are missing. France welcomes the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly on the 29th of June last of a resolution establishing an international independent humanitarian institution in order to help the families of missing persons in Syria. France is also concerned at the destabilization at the regional level that has been caused by the network which is producing and exporting Captagon. Today, this is one of the main financial resources for the Syrian regime, which has now become a narco-state. Madam President, given the dramatic situation in Syria, France and Europe stand in solidarity with the Syrian people. Since 2011, France, the European Union and its member states have financed United Nations agencies and civil society actors to the tune of 30 billion euros in Syria and in neighboring countries. The 7th Brussels conference on the 14th and 15th of June last made it possible to mobilize international aid in the amount of 5.6 billion euros for 2023 and beyond. I would recall that more than 90% of the aid comes from Europe, the United States, Canada, and Japan. Russia, for its part, is providing virtually no aid here as elsewhere. The countries of the region, despite the challenge that this represents, are hosting refugees. Our duty is to help them. Madam President, only a political solution will make it possible to put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people. The earthquakes of the 6th of February have only worsened the humanitarian situation. That notwithstanding, Russia has not hesitated to take more than 4 million Syrians hostage by opposing the renewal of the cross-border humanitarian mechanism. We support the efforts of the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs to propose access for aid. The needs have never been as high as they are now. In conclusion, I would like to recall our position. The humanitarian response must not and it cannot be a substitute for a political arrangement. A return to stability in Syria and the region will only be possible if there is a political solution which meets the aspirations of all Syrians. Resolution 2254 constitutes a roadmap with clear parameters. The Syrian regime must commit, finally, to a political process as defined in this resolution, which was adopted unanimously by this Council. The regime must make tangible gestures in order to start a genuine political process. No normalization or reconstruction or lifting of sanctions will be possible in the absence of a political transition as part of Resolution 2254. I would also indicate that by removing cross-border access, censoring cross-border access a few days ago, Russia, at the same time, censored the possibility of the United Nations to begin the early recovery operations. France reaffirms its full support to the mediation being carried out by Geir Pedersen, and we call for all actors to support his step-for-step approach. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to take this opportunity to align myself with the statement delivered by our colleague, the permanent representative of Brazil, our co-pen holder on the humanitarian issue. I wish to take this opportunity to add a few points in my national capacity on the political situation in Syria. I wish to begin by thanking Special Envoy Peterson not just for his briefing, but also especially for his ongoing efforts in the delivery of his mandate. Switzerland regrets the fact that regional and international dynamics that have emerged following the 6th February last earthquake have not yet allowed for efforts to be pooled with a view to improving the political, security, humanitarian, and economic situations in Syria. On the contrary, the current dynamics have unfortunately not resulted in de-escalation of the military situation, nor has humanitarian access been improved, nor has the political process been resumed. We regret the fact that the Security Council was not in a position to renew the mandate for the cross-border humanitarian assistance. assistance, we wish to recall that not only authorizing, but also facilitating the rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access for civilians in need, that this represents an obligation under international humanitarian law. The United Nations, as well as their partners, need to continue to be able to deliver assistance to people in need. Despite the current circumstances, we welcome the convening scheduled for 16 August 2023 of the first meeting of the Group of Contact established on the sidelines of the meeting of the Arab League on 7 May last. We wish to recall that states parties to the contact group expressed a desire to support a step-by-step approach in view of a political solution in coordination with the efforts of the special envoy. Switzerland once again emphasizes the relevance of Security Council Resolution 2254 to reach a fair and comprehensive solution to deliver peace and security for Syria and the region. The resumption of the work of the Constitutional Committee would generate an important message of support for seeking a concerted approach with a view to peace. Switzerland stands ready to offer Geneva, the headquarters of the United Nations in Europe, to host the meetings of the Constitutional Committee, as well as any other negotiations, talks, or initiatives geared towards promoting lasting peace in Syria. Madam President, it is of paramount importance for the ceasefire to be respected at the national level, already enduring a humanitarian, social, and economic situation that has never been this dire. Syrian civilian populations are far too frequently the victims of the armed conflict. According to the Secretary General's latest report on children in armed conflict, Syria is listed among those countries with the largest number of grave violations against children. The largest number of verified violations against children. All parties to conflict perpetrated violations against children, such as recruitment, murder, mutilation, maiming, as well as attacks targeting schools and hospitals. These violations must cease immediately, and we applaud the Secretary General's ongoing dialogue with the various parties to the conflict to that end. Switzerland urges all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law, specifically measures designed to protect civilian populations. Respect for human rights is also of key importance, specifically to respect and protect the dignity, the lives, and freedoms of each individual. Switzerland wishes to reiterate its full support for the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, whose work is of key importance to counter impunity. Thank you.
Representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm grateful for the information provided by the Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, as well as by the Director of Coordination for OCHA, Mr. Rajasingham. And I welcome the permanent representatives of Syria, Turkey and Iran. We are concerned at the lack of unity in the Security Council with regard to the situation in Syria, at a time when the humanitarian crisis has worsened as a result of the prolonged war and the effects of the earthquakes last February. My delegation reiterates the need to maintain formal access which will guarantee predictability, certainty and planning with regard to the provision of humanitarian assistance as established in preceding resolutions of this Security Council on the humanitarian file in Syria. We support the measures of the Secretary General through the United Nations agencies as the only agency that is able to establish strict monitoring that will help to increase transparency, efficiency and accountability for operations on the ground. Likewise, we support the committed work of the Special Envoy and the specialized agencies and the organizations associated with them working in the field. And we would ask that the treatment of refugees and those displaced will respect international human rights laws, particularly with regard to voluntary, secure and dignified return. On the 19th of July past, at the meeting of the General Assembly on the implementation of Resolution 76262, Ecuador lamented the fact that the veto had been used. In this regard, we would encourage the co-pen holders, Switzerland and Brazil, to not cease in their efforts and deliberations in order to find a mechanism that will make it possible for the Security Council to adopt a resolution that will ensure cross-border humanitarian assistance and will make it possible for teams on the ground to be able to meet their mandate within the framework of what is established under international humanitarian law. OCHA's figures reflect the urgency of resuming dialogue so that the humanitarian inputs can return to the northwest of Syria and assist 80% of the population which depends on them. Basically, all of them are women and children. We believe it's important to strengthen cooperation and links between regional actions and the United Nations in order to stop violent extremism, terrorism and narco-trafficking, which particularly affects women, children and those with disabilities. And we hope that the negotiations of the Special Envoy will lead to the reactivation of the Constitutional Committee. We would stress the need for the government of Syria to provide responses with regard to the whereabouts of missing persons and those that have been arbitrarily arrested or detained. The Security Council should continue to implement measures which will make it possible to once and for all put an end to violence, address the urgent humanitarian needs of the population, and to conclude an inclusive political negotiation based on the principles of sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity in accordance with the content of Resolution 2254 of 2015. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Coordination Director Rajasingham for their briefings. China supports the effort of the Special Envoy to continue advancing the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process as mandated by Resolution 2254 of this Council. We welcome Syria's return to the League of Arab States. We support the Arabic countries in the spirit of strength through unity, playing a greater constructive role in finding a political solution to the Syrian issue. Countries external to the region must fully respect the will and wishes of the countries in the region and their people, cease and desist from all rhetoric and actions that stand in the way of dialogue and reconciliation, and create an enabling external environment for engagement and consultation. China is concerned by the security situation in Syria. The international community must take a zero-tolerance approach to all elements of terrorism on the Syrian soil. A certain country has recently beefed up its illegal military presence in Syria, which China finds concerning. The illegal presence of foreign armed forces in Syria must be brought to an end without delay. Madam President, China supports the international community in providing assistance to all Syrian people who have humanitarian needs, provided that Syria's sovereignty and its government's ownership are fully respected. China welcomes the government's recent sovereign decision to open the Bab al-Hawa border crossing. It has been confirmed by OCHA that this permission by the Syrian government can indeed be the basis for the UN's lawful humanitarian operations. We encourage the UN to sort out any subsequent operational issues with the Syrian government through dialogue and consultation. We also wish to reiterate that the cross-border delivery mechanism was a context-specific expedient, and there is a need to speed up the transition to cross-line assistance so the former can be phased out and eventually discontinued. Fostering Syrian-owned capacity for its socio-economic recovery and development will go a long way towards easing the country's humanitarian woes. To this end, it is necessary to ensure the availability of adequate, balanced and sustainable funding to all parts of Syria, and to further broaden the scope of early recovery programs, as well as supporting sustainable development projects in key areas. Unilateral sanctions against Syria must be lifted without delay and without preconditions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I thank Mr. Geir Pedersen and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham for their briefings today. I would like to start today by addressing the humanitarian situation in light of the developments that we have witnessed over the past 2 weeks and their repercussions on the Syrian people. The rapid and unexpected end of the cross-border aid delivery mechanism to Syria was shocking for both the international community and the Syrian people. Although the end of this mechanism was inevitable in the future, given that it was always an exceptional and temporary solution, we had hoped that its conclusion would be carried out in coordination with the United Nations so that humanitarian workers on the ground would have the appropriate and sufficient time to plan for humanitarian operations in a gradual manner. As such, the international community should take practical steps to ensure the delivery of assistance to the Syrian people through all available modalities. In this context, the UAE welcomes again the Syrian government's decision to grant the United Nations permission to deliver humanitarian aid through the Bab al-Hawa crossing for a period of 6 months, especially considering that discussions between both sides have been and continue to be constructive in finding common ground and in reaching an understanding on several related issues. The interests of the Syrian people must remain at the center of all humanitarian efforts. In the meantime, we find it reassuring that aid is flowing through Bab al-Salama and Bab al-Ra'i crossings. Additionally, and although the mechanism has not been renewed, we affirm that the Council must continue to discuss the humanitarian track through these joint political and humanitarian meetings. Doing so remains essential, especially within the framework of the Council's work and its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. There are more than 15 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, half of whom are women and girls. We also underscore the importance of the Secretary General's reports, which ensure that the Council remains informed on relevant developments. Considering the continued deterioration of the humanitarian and security conditions in Al-Hol camp, we stress the need to find a sustainable and urgent solution to the situation. We also welcome Iraq's recent repatriation of approximately 200 of its citizens from Al-Hol camp. Additionally, we stress the need to support demining activities in Syria as part of early recovery projects, both to protect civilians from their danger and to create the appropriate conditions to ensure the safe and voluntary return of refugees and internally displaced persons. Moving to the political situation, we hope that the recent visits from Arab countries to Syria, especially from neighboring countries, will contribute to enhanced coordination and cooperation in addressing several issues of common interest to the countries of the region. This includes the return of refugees, combating terrorism, and drugs. We look forward to continuing Arab diplomatic efforts within the framework of the outcomes of the Jeddah summit and in close coordination with the United Nations envoy for Syria to pave the way towards the settlement of the Syrian crisis, which has not witnessed any tangible outcomes for far too many years. We believe that the empowerment of women in Syria, as well as strengthening their participation across the peace continuum, especially in mediation and dialogue, are critical steps to ensure that these efforts will be successful and sustainable. While we stress the need to preserve the independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, we also stress the need for de-escalation across all regions in Syria. This will contribute to the security and stability of the country and enhance regional security. As for the security situation, we note that it remains a source of concern as Daesh continues to carry out attacks in Syria. These attacks have resulted in civilian deaths and injuries, and have also obstructed the efforts of humanitarian workers and threatened their lives. In conclusion, we emphasize the need to move from managing the Syrian crisis to resolving it, adopting a fragmented approach has proven to be unsuccessful and will not achieve the necessary progress to end this crisis. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director of Coordination Rajasingham for their briefings. We agree with the sentiments expressed by the Special Envoy. If progress cannot be made on ensuring the continued principled delivery of humanitarian support to Syria, what hope do we have when it comes to the international cooperation needed on all aspects of the Syrian political file? Today, the Council holds its monthly meeting on Syria against the backdrop of a failure to renew the humanitarian cross-border mechanism on 11 July. Right across the country, wholesale destruction, conflict, the lack of basic services in education and health, and the recent scorching temperatures and wildfires further accelerate the mounting humanitarian needs. However, while Syrians continue to face this cascade of deprivation and hunger, which expose women and girls to the disproportionate risks of sexual violence and vulnerability, the ability of the international community to effectively deliver aid has been put into question. Russia's veto to end the cross-border mechanism, followed by Damascus's offer to access to the UN with unacceptable conditionalities attached, are worrying developments. We remain convinced that such decisions create too much uncertainty at this juncture in such a highly volatile context. Right now, civilians and humanitarian aid workers on the ground need all the support, stability, and predictability they can get, not unrealistic arrangements at the 11th hour. The conditional offer of a short-term authorization by Damascus exposes Syrians in the northwest to the same interference and manipulation of humanitarian aid they experienced before the creation of the cross-border mechanism. It is an attempt to obfuscate reality and contort international law in order to achieve a political objective. The text presented by Brazil and Switzerland represented a well-crafted compromise. Following weeks of negotiations, the co-pens struck a delicate balance that should have been acceptable to all sides. This renewal would have expanded humanitarian assistance, early recovery projects, mine action, cross-line aid, and support rehabilitation in areas of the country which would allow the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Syrian refugees and IDPs. All this in full accordance with international law and the humanitarian principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and humanity. Malta reaffirms the need for this Council to come together once again, to renew this cross-border mechanism, to allow the continued delivery of principled humanitarian assistance to those most in need in the northwest. We urge the Russian Federation to engage in negotiations to find a workable outcome. President, turning to the political file, Malta remains concerned at the continued lack of progress on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2554. While we take note of the decision of the League of Arab States to resume Syria's participation in meetings, it is critical that actions taken at the global level, including those agreed upon by the Security Council, are supported at the regional level. Progress on Resolution 2554 is the only way to achieve a just political solution and lasting peace in Syria. Malta calls again for the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee. Meaningful progress must be made to benefit the lives of millions of Syrians continuing to endure over decades of conflict. Amid the current situation across the country, we reiterate that conditions are still not in place for safe, voluntary, and dignified refugee returns. It is crucial for Damascus to cease its arbitrary detentions, enforce disappearances, torture, and ill-treatment of the Syrian people. President, I close by reiterating that this Council has the ability and the responsibility to find a compromise which can deliver for the Syrian people. We also stress that it must do so while maintaining the principles of humanitarian action, which safeguard the operational independence of the UN, its specialized agencies, and humanitarian partners. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Madam President, I thank Special Envoy Peterson and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, OCHA Director of Coordination, for their briefings. It has been nearly 2 weeks since Russia vetoed the resolution that would have extended the cross-border mechanism for aid delivery. When needs in Syria are at an all-time high, such an outrageous act politicizes humanitarian assistance and is a painful betrayal of the Syrian people, including women and children, for whom the continued provision of aid is a matter of life or death. Japan continues to believe that cross-border assistance provided under Security Council resolution is the best way to ensure the necessary predictability, transparency, and accountability required by donors and humanitarian actors, including the UN and NGOs. All this in turn facilitates the early recovery assistance so much needed by the people of Syria. Indeed, Council members continue to exert all efforts to adopt a new resolution extending the mechanism under the coordination of the co-pen holders, Switzerland and Brazil, but so far there is no breakthrough. UN operations there remain suspended, and cross-line assistance has not yielded sufficient results. As we stand idle, situation on the ground worsens day by day. Under such circumstances, the delivery of assistance to the Syrian people who are surviving daily hardships must be the priority. This is the reason why Japan extends its assistance not only through cross-border mechanisms but also for all parts of Syria. We therefore fully support USG Griffith's effort to explore options with the Syrian government on specific modalities for the timely resumption of assistance via Balab Hawa, pending a new resolution of the Security Council. We strongly encourage such efforts so that aid can be delivered without constraints at the same scale and speed as before. The recent decision by the Syrian government to allow UN cross-border aid via Bab al-Hawa includes impractical restrictions for humanitarian actors. We would like to request maximum flexibility from the Syrian government in dealing with this purely humanitarian issue. If an agreement on these modalities is reached between both parties and a certain level of transparency is ensured, including through a monitoring mechanism, this would be an important step for donor countries to continue the assistance to Syria. And in this regard, we wish to continuously receive the bi-monthly Secretary General report. And furthermore, the UN's funding scheme for NGOs needs to be continued pending a new resolution of the Security Council. Lastly, we must also consider the country's long-term future. While we are aware of Arab regional efforts to advance the political process based on Resolution 2254, the political track remains frozen, including the Constitutional Committee. Without a fundamental political solution to the Syrian crisis, the impoverishment of nearly 90% of Syrians living below the poverty line will continue to deepen, and issues of refugees, the internally displaced, and missing persons will remain difficult to resolve. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Pedersen for your briefing and also Director Rajasingham for your briefing and for the work of your teams on the ground. 2 weeks ago, Russia vetoed the 9-year-old UN mandate to provide humanitarian assistance to the 4.1 million people in need in northwest Syria. Those 4.1 million people are now living in a limbo, not knowing if food and medicines will reach them in the coming weeks and months. In those 2 weeks, as we've heard, not a single truck has crossed the Bab al-Hawa crossing, where 85% of UN assistance previously transited. Not one truck. Because although Syria say they have given the UN permission, the conditions that Assad has set out make it unsafe to do so. And the UN has been clear that the conditions Syria has set out are inoperable and unworkable. They also undermine OCHA's neutrality, impartiality, and independence. The crossings the UN now has to use instead at Bab al-Salam and Bab al-Rai are currently open only for another 21 days and not set up for the capacity that was crossing at Bab al-Hawa. I myself saw on the 8th of June when I was there 60 trucks crossing, and that contrasts to the 18 trucks that the UN has managed to get across in the last week. So Russia and Syria's claims that they're driven purely by humanitarian considerations is simply not supported by the facts on the ground. The northwest of Syria is an active conflict zone where all parties, including the regime and Russia, continue to launch attacks with civilians caught in the crossfire. The United Kingdom supports the ongoing discussions between the UN and Syria to lift its conditions and let the aid flow. It's critical that humanitarian access is negotiated with all conflict actors and that aid reaches the most vulnerable according to humanitarian principles. The lack of a council mandate affects longer-term early recovery work as well, that this council has agreed is essential across Syria. So we continue to believe that action by this council, with politics set aside, is the best way to ensure access continues to those who need it. In the meantime, we urge Syria to live up to its obligations under international law and engage with the UN in good faith. Ultimately, the people of Syria and the wider region need a sustainable end to this conflict in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. So we encourage a resumption of Constitutional Committee talks in Geneva without further delay and without further excuses. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid al-Rais.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, given a serious and ongoing escalation in our region, the Israeli occupying forces continue their aggression against the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, against our territorial integrity. Moreover, constantly they continue these criminal practices against our population in the occupied Syrian Golan. The Israeli occupation forces on the 19th of July last carried out a new air attack, a barrage of missiles from the north of the occupied Golan, aiming certain points around Damascus, which led to the wounding of 2 soldiers and material damage. Israel, moreover, has once again violated the Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981 by tearing down the remaining houses in Ain Fit and making this into a military position for Israeli forces. This village was destroyed in 1967 by occupation and its population chased away. The Syrian Arab Republic firmly condemns all of these barbaric acts conducted by Israel. And in June, the Security Council should have condemned this with regard to the maintenance of international peace and security and acted immediately to put an end to the crimes of the Israeli occupying forces and to begin a serious process of accountability to ensure that these events are not repeated. It is deplorable that this council is paralyzed when it comes to responding to these violations. Under the cover of this protection provided by the United States of America to Israel, this support blind support for Israel makes the United States an accomplice in these serious violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. Madam President, at a time when all Security Council resolutions with regard to Syria reiterate the need to respect the sovereignty of this country and territorial integrity and independence, certain members of this Council continue to commit serious violations of those same resolutions. And here I would draw your attention to the fact that my delegation has informed the Security Council that a delegation of the French Foreign Affairs Ministry illegally entered Syrian territory and conducted meetings with representatives of those that call themselves the Independent Authorization Separatist Militia. Syria condemns this flagrant violation of our sovereignty. We believe that this is irresponsible behavior and once again proof of the commitment of France, a permanent member of the Security Council, to destroy Syria and support terrorist groups and separatist militia. Madam President, with regard to the humanitarian situation in Syria, the Syrian Arab Republic is committed to guaranteeing the provision of humanitarian aid to those that need it in the northwest of our country. And given the hot-headedness of certain members of the Security Council, in the light of their refusal to respond to the legitimate concerns of Syria that were expressed very many times with regard to the cross-border mechanism, that prevented the implementation of Resolution 2672. Syria took a sovereign decision to grant the UN and the United Nations agencies the authorization to use the Bab al-Hawa crossing to provide humanitarian assistance to the region for a period of 6 months from the 13th of July 2023. The Syrian Arab Republic reiterates that we have not imposed any conditions. We are fully open to cooperating bilaterally with the United Nations and OCHA, particularly with regard to parameters for action, with regard to the authorization granted by the Syrian authorities in order to cooperate and coordinate between the two parties, basing ourselves on the guiding principle of the United Nations with regard to humanitarian assistance, reiterated in General Assembly Resolution 46/182. And the cooperation that we plan to strengthen to improve the humanitarian response, basing ourselves, as we have done from the beginning, on the respect for the sovereignty of the state concerned. The complementarity of action through the three crossing points approved by the Syrian government via a through a sovereign decision, the crossing points that the Syrian government has agreed, Samadar and Sarakib as well, are able to sufficiently provide, those cross-line points are able to provide sufficient humanitarian assistance to the needs on the ground. But it also means that maximum pressure should be applied to the terrorist groups and their commanders in the northwest of Syria so that the humanitarian aid can reach its destination. And also, the necessary funding needs to be provided for these humanitarian operations. Particularly, it needs to be predictable. My delegation reiterates that an improvement in the humanitarian situation requires the provision of sustainable solutions for the Syrian people after particularly the terrible earthquake of the 6th of February. So that the humanitarian assistance that is so life-saving can be provided, and that there are conditions in place for the safe, dignified return of Syrians to their villages, guaranteed particularly through early recovery projects, demining, and the immediate and unconditional lifting of unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States and the European Union in an inhumane and immoral fashion on Syria and on the Syrian people. The report of the Special Rapporteur on the negative effects of the unilateral coercive measures on human rights of the Human Rights Council that was issued at the beginning of this month, and I quote, says, "The regime of unilateral coercive measures and their totalitarian nature and their repeated use, particularly after the United States of America in 2019 applied the Caesar law, has led the country into an impasse, and that has had negative and lasting effects on a huge number of series of human rights." End of quotation. Madam President, the most recent report of the Secretary General states that the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people has increased, and that the basic service access is even more restricted, particularly a worsening of the of medical care and a serious water crisis that was followed by a cholera epidemic. The ICRC mission in Damascus has informed us that it has been able to conduct a visit to the prison of the vocational training school in the Guera area, in the area controlled by civilian militia working together with Americans illegally. And the ICRC noted the seriousness of the situation. The majority of those detained are suffering from acute malnutrition and are suffering from tuberculosis. The ICRC warned against the spread of disease, not within the prison itself and the surrounding area, but more broadly, not just there, but more broadly, and beyond Syria's borders. Ladies and gentlemen, what is of particular concern is the suffering of our citizens in the village of Al-Hasaka and the areas around the Al-Aluk water station because of cuts to the water supply carried out by the occupying forces and terrorist groups and separatist militia and their commanders. More than 1 million Syrians in the area no longer have drinking water. This is a war crime, a crime against humanity, and a serious threat to public health, particularly with regard to the very high temperatures. Syria requires that the United Nations and its agencies act immediately to ensure that the water can flow from Al-Aluk fully and make it possible for the technical teams to go there to supervise the work to ensure that the water station can work sustainably. It is a scandal that certain delegations are ignoring these facts, and they're trying to politicize this discussion and to undermine efforts of the Syrian government rather than working as a matter of urgency to resolve these urgent humanitarian issues. In conclusion, Madam President, the Syrian Arab Republic once again insists that an end be put to the illegal presence of foreign forces on our territory, headed at the head of those the Americans, that they stop interfering in the internal affairs of Syria and their support for terrorist groups, that the pillaging of natural resources of Syria stop, particularly oil, And also we call for the complete, immediate, unconditional lifting of unilateral coercive measures imposed on the Syrian people, which constitute a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and resolutions of the Security Council with regard to Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We would like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Rajasingham for their briefings as well. The Security Council is meeting for the 4th time this month to address the humanitarian situation in Syria. Meanwhile, 4.1 million Syrians who depend on UN's cross-border aid to survive continue their weeks-long wait to see if this life-saving aid will or will not continue to flow. As an immediate neighbor to Syria and the UN's main partner on cross-border assistance, we would like to emphasize once again that under the current circumstances, the Security Council mandated cross-border humanitarian mechanism is the most viable, transparent, impartial, and predictable method of aid delivery to northwest Syria. We therefore regret that this mandate expired 2 weeks ago, and the Security Council has not yet been able to agree on its renewal. Further increasing our concern, this development is happening at a time when the humanitarian needs, which are exacerbated due to the earthquakes, are now at their highest level since the start of the conflict in Syria. Today, the cross-border mechanism is more essential than ever to effectively address the humanitarian situation in the country and also to maintain the critically important regional stability. We share the concerns expressed by the United Nations regarding the conditional and time-limited permission by the Syrian regime for the use of Bab el-Hawa border crossing. We underline that the absence of a council-mandated cross-border mechanism will create a void in the predictability, accountability, and effectiveness of aid deliveries. The lack of predictability, which defines the situation today, would make it harder to secure funding for humanitarian activities in Syria. Predictability is also key for planning and execution stages of humanitarian action, without which, for instance, early recovery and resilience projects would also be jeopardized. The number of people in need of humanitarian assistance in Syria is at its highest. This is not the time to risk the access of millions of Syrians to uninterrupted and predictable humanitarian assistance in a safe, transparent, and accountable manner. We therefore renew our call on the Security Council members to engage in further efforts to reach a practical and realistic consensus that would ensure the continuation of the UN cross-border aid mechanism. Madam President, the deeply worrying humanitarian situation in Syria constantly reminds us the increasingly heavy toll of the ongoing conflict on the Syrian people. The efforts towards the political settlement of the conflict urgently need to be stepped up. The international community, especially the countries with influence, should act now and urge the regime to take concrete steps in the political process. A lasting solution to the Syrian conflict will only be possible with the participation of all Syrian parties in the political track. Therefore, it is essential that the Syrian opposition be included in efforts towards a political solution to the conflict. As Special Envoy Pedersen underlined, the Constitutional Committee, as the most effective platform that brings together the Syrian opposition and the regime, should continue its work in a way that will produce tangible results. The revitalization of the political process is also among the objectives of our engagement. Similarly, we expect our friends in the region to also keep in mind the importance of the political process in resolving the Syrian conflict in their engagements with the regime, and to provide encouragement in this direction. Madam President, the terrorism emanating from Syria is a major threat that requires urgent solution. Turkey is among the countries that make the most effort in the fight against Daesh and was effective in ending its territorial control in Syria. Turkey also continues its fight against the PKK-YPG terrorist organization with the same determination. PKK-YPG terrorist organization conducted more than 70 attacks on our borders, especially from Tel Rifat, since the beginning of this year alone. Like any country whose borders and citizens are attacked, Turkey will not remain silent and reserves its inherent right to self-defense. Before concluding, I would also like to draw attention to the ongoing ceasefire violations in Idlib, where an escalation, coupled with current difficult humanitarian circumstances, may expose a new risk of mass migration, which must be avoided. Therefore, we would like to emphasize the importance of the maintenance of ceasefire in Idlib. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Madam President, we thank Mr. Peterson, Special Envoy, and Mr. Rajasingham, Director of Coordination, OCHA, for the update and informative briefings. Madam President, the escalating humanitarian situation in Syria demands urgent and impartial humanitarian aid. The delivery of assistance to all regions of Syria devoid of any political influence is paramount to saving lives and reaching the most vulnerable individuals. Despite the Security Council failure to reach an agreement on resolution for a cross-border mechanism, the UN has continued to use all available access modalities to reach people in need. In this context, Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai continue to be in use for the cross-border movement and UN aid delivery, which have significantly improved direct and efficient access to affected individuals, enabling enhanced humanitarian operations. In the meantime, the Syrian government, in a sovereign decision in July 13th, granted permission for a 6-month period to the United Nations and its relevant specialized agencies to utilize the Bab al-Hawa crossing point, thus creating a legal basis for delivering humanitarian assistance to the northwest region of the country. Respecting Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity throughout the processes is crucial in addressing the humanitarian crisis effectively. As such, preventing aid diversion to terrorist organizations in the northwest region and ensuring transparent and non-discriminatory distribution of aid are essential aspects that need careful consideration. Iran commends the tireless efforts of the UN agencies and humanitarian partners in their work toward alleviating the suffering of Syrian people. Madam President, in addition to providing immediate relief, aid operations in Syria must focus on infrastructure restoration, reconstruction initiatives, and overall economy recovery. Such an approach has the potential to create an environment favorable to the voluntary return of refugees and displaced people to their homes. Given the burden the neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon, have carried during the crisis, the return of refugees and internally displaced people to their respective homes in Syria should not be politicized or used as leverage against the Syrian government. To this end, it is imperative that the international donors fulfill their obligations and provide the necessary funding for the activities and the program of the United Nations. This support is crucial for the implementation of projects outlined in the humanitarian response plan and a strategic framework for cooperation between Syria and the United Nations. These projects aim to revitalize the economy and facilitate the dignified and voluntary return of refugees and displaced individuals to their homes. Madam President, the continuation of unilateral sanctions against Syria is a key impediment to improving Syrian humanitarian and economic plight. We firmly reiterate our call for an immediate end to these illegal and cruel measures which have damaged the country, the economy, and people's daily lives while limiting the government's ability to provide essential services. The recent report by the Special Reporter of the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, dated 3 July 2023, shed light on the dire situation in Syria resulting from unilateral sanctions and over-compliance. The finding, based on Ms. Duhan's visit to Syria from 31 October to 10 November 2022, highlight the severe damage caused the economy, leading to the grave humanitarian rights violation and imposing immense humanitarian challenges. The Secretary General's recent report submitted in accordance with Resolution 2672 also underlined the devastating consequences of sanctions on humanitarian relief delivery and access to essential services. Madam President, Iran remains committed to cooperating with its partners in Astana process to achieve long-term and sustainable normalization in Syria. We continue our support for the ongoing Syrian-Turkish dialogue, recognizing its crucial role in these broader efforts. We support the resumption of Constitutional Committee meeting at earliest opportunity to continue the progress made toward resolving the crisis. In this context, we remain committed in our support of the Special Envoy Affairs and his engagement with all parties. Iran once more condemned the continuous acts of aggression and military attacks by Israeli regime against Syria, particularly those that target civilian infrastructure alongside the persistent occupation of the Syrian Golan. The Security Council must address the malicious activities and acts of aggression by the Israeli regime that clearly contravene the international law and international humanitarian law and violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syrian Arab Republic. Moreover, these malign activities not only destabilize the region but also exacerbate tensions. In conclusion, Iran reaffirmed its commitment to continue support the people and government of Syria in overcoming the threats of terrorism. We stand ready to assist in rebuilding their country, ensuring its unity and preserving its territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.